So I'm the president of Voyager, one of the two founders of the company, as you mentioned. And we're building the replacement for the International Space Station, except the replacement of the ISS will not be owned by the government. It'll be owned by a private company, Voyager, and some of our partners and investors. And by way of background, before I started Voyager, I was a private equity investor. I was in the private equity investment team at Goldman Sachs, their global headquarters in New York City, and then did some middle market private equity, and then started Microsoft as an F-15 fighter pilot in the U.S. military. So when you think about space and Voyager and what I'm doing, we've acquired 7 space companies in the last 4 years as part of the space station supply chain, if you will. So when you kind of add all those things together, what you get is, for me, there's a lot of aerospace, obviously a lot of research and development, business, and just general operations. And plus, it's just really cool to be in space and every day wake up and think about how to build a replacement for the ISS, but we're going to own it. So,
first of all, how many people are going to be able to fit on your space station?
So, interesting question. So I'll give you a little bit more background as well. So the ISS, when you look at like the Discovery Channel and you see the modules and the astronauts are kind of floating through and all the wires and stuff, those modules are 4.2 meters in diameter. And it was built over a series of over 20 different launches and assembled in space, over $100 billion. And then that doesn't include any OpEx. And part of that is launching. It's about $100 million a launch or so. And then assembling in space is very risky. And if you think, well, as a private company, I don't want to do that many launches, and I don't want to put together stuff in space, because when I'm connecting things in space, I'm not generating, revenue and profit. But we're able to launch Starlab, which is the name of our space station, in a single launch, and we'll have about 55% the volume of the ISS. That's like living volume. And then about 100% of the research and development.
Is the plan to have a whole bunch of these space stations in space?
Maybe. So Starlab is specifically, we're in a public-private partnership with NASA and the United States government. And we can talk about the history and evolution of the business model if you'd like. So this specific one is to specifically replace the ISS. Now, if another nation state or another private entity wants their own station, this first one is a public-private partnership. Voyager will own it. We'll own it. We'll get the cash flows. It's a 30-year infrastructure investment. It's a 30-year useful life. Any future stations, think of that as probably a firm fixed price contract where we would deliver a station, but then we would probably have an OpEx tail where we would actually help operate and manage it, because most folks don't know how to operate a space station.
That's amazing. So first of all, I think it's incredible that's a private company that is doing this. Look, as we know from our studies of evolution, when fish first started walking on land, that represented a massive transformation in evolution. And now we're at a very similar state where we're going from land to space. Now, there's been a lot of debates about colonizing or exploring and settling the plateaus of space versus the gravity wells of space, so to speak. What are your thoughts as we talk about the future of space, given that you're on the cutting edge of that, on what is the most effective way to have a substantial portion of the population be able to live sustainably in space?
So a couple ways. One, our friends at SpaceX are definitely a key contributor to that. Lowering the price just to access space is very important. As a demonstration of that, we started a nonprofit in 2016 called Space for Humanity. And that's kind of like the heart of Voyager versus the make money side of Voyager. And we've sent 3 people to space, and we paid for it in the last 6 years. We sent the first female in the history of Mexico to space, the first female in the history of Egypt to space. These are suborbital flights, but when they come back down to Earth, Katya, for example, from Mexico, she's a celebrity in Mexico. She's meeting with the president. She's on Time Magazine. They made a Barbie doll of her. But there's this notion called the overview effect, which is basically a known psychological shift. We're actually partnered with the University of Pennsylvania to study this, where when you look at the Earth from the outside in, and you see the curvature of the Earth, and no boundaries, and no languages, no religions, no genders, just Mother Earth, you realize, and you look up and you see the black void of space, you realize that Earth is actually very abnormal. We just don't see it and realize it because our perspective is limited by what we've experienced. But if you look up, 99.999% of what is a black, vacuumless, cold, dark void of space. And we're this little oasis. And they have this psychological shift, and they come back down. And with Space for Humanity, they're an ambassador now to their local community to talk about how that actually changed what they do and how they approach life. What if you put, two presidents or heads of states from, adversarial countries in a space station and then look out the window together? Like, what would that do? Maybe nothing. Maybe it would do something. So the combination of lowering access to space and having folks come back and act as ambassadors will help with that. And the last thing I'd say, when you think about the history of things like sailing and oceanic travel, I think it was 1522, Ferdinand Magellan kind of did his round the world trip. He didn't actually quite make it. He died in Southeast Asia, but his final ship did, and one of the 10. And now there was like one person, and then now there's tens of millions of people go on cruises every year. Aviation, the Wright brothers did their first flight 119 years ago, I think it was, if you do the math. Think about that. In the history of the world, no one had ever flown an airplane, ever. Almost everyone here probably flew an airplane today and didn't even think about it. So we're at this interesting inflection point with space, which is hard to believe. Humans think linearly, we don't think exponentially, whether it's personal wealth creation, technology development. You make, I made $1 million. Okay, that's great. Next thing you know, you're like, I'm going to have 5. And the next thing you have, 500 million or $1 billion. Same thing with technology. So when you think through space, in the history of space, there's been about 600 people that have ever traveled to space in the history of humanity. So think about that. The first human to fly to space was in the late 1950s from the Soviet Union. And last year, last couple of years, we've had 30. And by the time, I'm in my 70s, we're going to have thousands or maybe tens of thousands. And our children, there will be millions of people that will fly to space. And it sounds crazy. We can't think that way, but it's happening. And there's a reason for that, whether it's research and development, tourism, exploration is in our DNA. So we're at this really interesting opportunity in our specific lifespan right here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the space is fascinating, right? What do you think that's going to do when we're transitioning from a model where the only people that go to space are specially trained Air Force pilots and professional astronauts to moving towards a world where you have regular people going to space on a regular basis? How do you think that'll impact the world and the future?
Certainly. I mean, so I went to the Air Force Academy and I flew the F-15 for over a decade. And when you think about this, every year was just like a normal thing. Like, hey, you're going to apply to test pilot school, the astronaut program, and some people did, some people didn't. Of those 600 astronauts, about 50 of them graduated from my university because typically you're like the space shuttle commander or the commander of the ISS. And so when you think about that, particularly in the U.S. government, initially it was mostly military, the right stuff kind of folks. There's a brand new space station that was recently launched. You may or may not know about it. It's a year old. It's called the Tiangong Space Station. It's owned by the People's Republic of China. Every single person they've put up into space is an active duty military or their member, and all but one are fighter pilots from the People's Republic of China. Now, with that being said, that's actually what the United States did. It's the same thing. It's kind of like you're doing this research and development. How do you use space? But as it becomes more commercialized, you're seeing a little bit of this already. What happens instead if you just send a bunch of military folks? You send a poet or an artist. You send, certain politicians, right? Ambassador Nelson, who's the head of NASA right now, Senator Nelson, who's the head of NASA, he was an astronaut. So if you just kind of think through what would happen if you would start to send these different types of groups where you typically don't affiliate with space, they might pay to go to space, and their whole mission might be to look out the window for 2 weeks and do paintings and art.
Did you know when you were young that you wanted to be an astronaut? Did you know you wanted to be in the space sector, or is that something kind of developed over time?
I've always been interested in space. My mother still has this small little note I wrote when I was like 8. I was reading the newspaper. I read some article about a satellite, and I think I wrote on a sticky note in my 8-year-old scratchy language that I want to fly satellites when I grow up. Not quite understanding you don't really fly satellites. But I've always been interested in space. I used space-based assets a lot when I was a fighter pilot, whether it was imagery, navigation, communication types of things. The further I got into it, the more I didn't really seem too interested in